And today we have this eagerly anticipated Slow Food Live, which is done in collaboration with our Slow Books Community Action Team. And they really wanted to feature a book that would help with our Plant a Seed campaign, which is our annual campaign that was featuring beans and heirloom beans and the stories that beans can really teach us about climate change, about nutrition, and about food sovereignty. And the book that they chose for the network-wide read is the one we're covering today, which is Grist, a practical guide to cooking beans, seeds, and legumes. And it is a gorgeous book. I'm sure most of you have it, or if you haven't bought it yet, you should. But we're dropping a link in the chat about our bookshop site where you can definitely get Abra's books there. It has just been a really fun book to engage with our Slow Books team. And they've created a discussion guide and a set of resources related to the book that you can find also the link to. It's really a great resource to help engage with the book on a deeper level. If you have any sort of discussion groups that you're engaging with around the book, we can help guide those discussions as well. So let's get started by introducing our two wonderful guests. I know that they barely need any introduction at this point because we've been talking about them through our social media platforms for so long, but we're so grateful to have Abra Berens, who's the chef at Granor Farm, and she combines her love of Michigan, of cooking vegetables and grains just pulled from the ground and sharing them with others around one big table. You've been cooking since 2006, and we are so excited to have you here to talk about your book today. Next to you is Wesley Rieth. He's the operations manager there at Granor Farms, who spent most of his life in Southwest Michigan and started farming full-time in 2016, and can often be found under the hood of a tractor is what I hear. So we're going to hear a lot about your roles at Granor Farm to get started. So welcome, the two of you. It's so great to have you here.
Oh man, it's such a treat to be here. And, Slow Food is just such an important institution. And I feel like it kind of parallels my first paying attention to food when I was cooking at Zingerman's. And so to be able to participate and to have this conversation with Wesley is just I feel like we've been looking forward to it since, April when we first started talking about it. But yeah, so thanks for having us.
Totally. Well, that's so nice. I'd love to hear a little bit more about Granor Farms and your roles there. I'll just toss it to you. Tell us a little bit about where you're sitting today.
Yeah. Granor Farm is an idea with a lot of different iterations that have followed it. The farm began in 2008, and it began around this idea of education. The farm's owners came from Chicago, and their children at the time kind of had, they saw the disconnect with them going to school and eating in the cafeteria and just seeing they don't really know where their food is coming from. And so the original idea with Granor Farm was to have a farm camp for kids. And the idea was to bring kids to the farm every single summer so they could really get a fundamental and foundational education to where their food came from. And we quickly realized we can't support a farm just on a farm camp. So we added diversified vegetable production through a CSA program and our own farm stand here on the farm. And we still do that today. And so kind of fast forward several years, and we still do the vegetables. We do the CSA program. We host over 100 kids every summer through 4 weeks of farm camp. We also farm a few hundred acres of grains, mostly organic, some transitional. And we host folks here almost every weekend for dinners. And kind of with each of those programs, try to offer a different educational component to why food matters. We're a farm like a lot of other farms. We're a for-profit entity. We're a business. We try to make ends meet every single year, growing the food that we love and sharing it with folks. But we try to do that intentionally around giving folks something to take home with them, usually in the form of knowledge about why this matters and why the food that we grow matters to them. Yeah, so that's kind of in essence, what we're trying to do here at Granor Farm.
It really underscores the value of community being able to come onto farmland and really engage with their food in this way. I think it's a great example of a welcoming environment. You know, I think a lot of Americans don't know that they can go visit farms and don't know that they can just like engage directly with their farmers and the people that are growing and cooking their food. How many, do you have any stats on like how many schools come to visit every year, or any sort of stats about the people who visit?
It's a good question. How many people?
It is. I mean, I think to your point, it's, you know, Wes kind of gave me a data point a little while back that was at the last farm census, which was in 2017, about 3% of America's population are farmers, and 100 years ago it was 30%.
Right.
And that's a tremendous difference. And there's lots of factors and reasons that go into that. But for me, I think one of the kind of most interesting side points to that is just how many fewer people are interacting with farmers. And so by that lack of connection, I think we're seeing sort of a decrease in understanding of the work, and also a decrease in the sort of shared empathy of what it takes to bring this food to market. So that's really at the heart of kind of all of our programming, if you want to call it that, is to always be tightening that connection. And so I think to your question about how many people or what type of people, you know, we're really close to the lake. So we have a wonderful summer population of people who are coming to visit, or people who have second homes here, as well as a thriving population. And so I would say that we get a seasonal swell, but it's pretty normal for our farm store on the weekends in the summer to have a couple hundred people come through. And then, you know, we have 50 or so people come to dinner on Friday and Saturday nights. And then if you kind of extrapolate out on all of the folks who are interacting, especially with the grain that Wes is growing, you know, that's a wide wholesale list. And so it's really sort of daunting when you think about like every year, what like thousands of people are coming through and getting to like, maybe that's one of their few connections with how food is grown, and and we aim to find a way for people to interact in any way that suits them, you know. So if that's a $3 bunch of radishes, or if it's a $200 person dinner, or it's brunch that's a little bit less, or they're coming and sending their kids to camp and they're able to see the farm while their kids are at camp, we're really trying to create lots of those entry points to try to develop that shared empathy and understanding of what it means to be a grower.
Yeah, that sounds really wonderful. I think, you know, those firsthand experiences can be so pivotal and crucial for people, just like you working at Zingerman's. You know, it opened up this whole opportunity for you to engage with food in a different way, engage with slow food, and engage with a farming community as well. Wes, can you talk with us a little bit about the seeds at Granor Farm, and like how are you, what's the program there? Are you guys saving seeds? Are you also developing any varieties? I'm curious about the grain and bean program.
Sure. Yeah, the answer to your question is kind of an all of the above. Yes, we do a lot of different things when it comes to sourcing our own seeds for what we're growing every year. And that's a kind of a complicated equation around what we think our buyers and our the folks we work with are going to want, because we have long-term multi-year relationships with a lot of the people that we sell our grain to. And that's always a conversation around quality and flavor and different attributes that folks are looking for in a particular type of grain, because, you know, wheat is not wheat. Like there's so many intricacies to a lot of these different types of grains that we grow. And so we're always trying to find what works well for us geographically, what works well for our buyers, what's agronomically feasible for us to grow. And so what that means for purchasing seed is that, every year we do rely on, a lot of the research conducted by, universities and seed breeders across the country that are developing varieties specific for organic production. There's a lot of really important work that goes on every year with the research and variety development and testing that goes into developing, these varieties of grains that work really well in organic systems. And beyond that, we do, with a couple varieties in particular, save our own seed every year. We have a couple heirloom and landrace varieties of wheat that we're trying to cultivate that we've started from, peck to seed about this big. and maybe 100 seeds of wheat. And for anyone that's growing wheat, that 100 seeds maybe sounds like a lot. It's really a relatively small amount. I mean, you need many thousands of seeds to make one loaf of bread. So we've been slowly growing some of these varieties year over year, harvesting the seed, saving it all to plant again, and evaluating those as we go. Really, it's like this kind of giant Sudoku puzzle, if you want to think about, of all these different constraints that we have when it comes to developing and using certain varieties of seed here on the farm. But we're really lucky to be in a climate and a geographical location where we can grow a lot of different things. Berrien County and this part of Southwest Michigan that we are was at one point in time the most agriculturally diverse place in the country, outside of California. And we are no longer that, but it kind of speaks to the fact that we can grow, annual crops here like corn and soybeans and edible beans and all different kinds of things. We can grow tree fruit, we can grow berries, we can grow grapes.
Yeah.
All that existed here in this county, and we're really proud to kind of carry on that legacy by cultivating a wide variety of grains here at the farm.
Yeah, that biodiversity is really crucial, isn't it? I mean, to have access to so many different varieties that maybe can shine in some years, in these times of climate change. I think you're probably experiencing, like most farmers, maybe some varieties aren't as productive as they used to be, or maybe we're dealing with drought conditions, and there's other varieties that might be more successful in those years where those are challenges that we're facing. And I'm curious if you've noticed any sort of climatic changes in your time growing these crops.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, it's hard to overstate. It's hard to overstate that in my mind. I think in terms of how the climate affects what we can and can't grow. I mean, my viewpoint on this is just contained in the number of years I've been involved in farming. So, I've lived here in Southwest Michigan most of my life, but that's still a relatively small time capsule in terms of the grand scheme of things. But nonetheless, I think it is important for us to observe and watch and see how, certain varieties behave, with wheat and cereal grains specifically. We're used to seeing a lot more rain now in the spring than we've ever had before, and larger rains than we usually have, and more frequent. What that means for an organic producer like myself is if we get lots of wet and humid weather in the springtime, we can develop lots of fungal diseases on some of our cereal grains and things that make it unable to be used for any kind of food grade purpose, is usually what we're aiming for. And so what that means for us is we're relying on a lot of these, the seed breeders and the research happening to come up with varieties that are resistant to some of those, fungal viruses, because we don't use fungicides here on the farm. We don't have another tool in the toolbox. So we really have to rely on the power of that seed, of that variety, to kind of get us to a point where we can rely on what we're planting.
It's fascinating stuff. It's a moving target, isn't it? And just
Absolutely.
like every year, it's just so, what are we going to grow this year? And what do the conditions seem like? And, what's available to grow? And what are our favorites too, right? Like it comes down to taste a lot of the time, and a lot of the demands, the demand of the people eating those things, like what are the favorites, and what if there's a threshold for new varieties, and, the education around that, I can imagine it would be a challenge as well. Let's talk a little bit about the relationship between the farm and the kitchen, and how that relationship comes together. Abra, I believe you were farming for a while. Is that right? You also have experience farming.
Yeah, I started a vegetable farm in 2009. And I think what you just said is a really important point for folks to hammer home, which is that, when you're looking at agricultural production, I think it's rare for people to understand truly how that is an annual cycle. And so, Wes has said before, like with each season, you get that one shot. And so while you can look at some of these trends for weather, there's no way to pivot. It's not like you can just run out and get the raincoat or replant real quick in the middle of July and still get a crop that year. And so I think that is one of the challenges when we talk about climate collapse and sort of how climate is affecting this growing, is that it's not something like in the kitchen, if a hailstorm comes through and ruins all of the tomatoes, we can put a different dish on the menu. But we can't get those tomatoes back, or we can't, bring those crops back from that fungal infection in the spring. And I think that that is something that is really critical for people to understand, that not only does that affect your output, but that affects your cash flow and how much money you have to borrow to buy that seed in the spring. And our system is not built the way any other business is built, in that farmers are often borrowing for seed that's already been planted, and so the cash flow doesn't line up with that production. And so when you start to get these cataclysmic events, it's really hard to recover from them. And I think that Mike Bloomberg famously said, "What's so hard about farming? You put a seed in the ground and wait." And I think that that is really indicative of how that disconnect between how much creativity and ingenuity goes into this problem solving. Because you can, what's the phrase? You can plan a pretty picnic, but you can't predict the weather. And so like you can do all that planning in January and February with your crop rotation. And I think that's what I find so interesting about Wes's work, is that, he's growing cereal grains on about just shy of 400 acres. And there's 12 or so different crops, which, doesn't sound like as many crops as the veg fields, which are producing 100 different varieties of something. But most grain growers are growing 2 crops, corn and soy. And so if one of those fails, that's where crop insurance comes in. That's what a lot of those things aren't available. Those policy issues are not available to growers in the sort of grainer category. And so that resiliency has to come from crop rotation and having a backup plan for it. And so that's kind of a long-winded answer to say, what's the relationship between the field and the kitchen for us? And for us, it is to provide another outlet for that resiliency, and while trying to make a delicious meal. So if all of the buckwheat doesn't thresh properly, I'm using terms I don't actually use on a regular basis, so bear with me. But then we can make that change. Or if say the pinto beans are not, Wes isn't happy with them, and so he doesn't want to showcase them the dinner, we can use the Montcalm red ones. We have that flexibility, and that also creates a value added product for it. And so I think that something like you're going to get a higher, it's very similar to, in our area, we have a lot of farm stands, and a lot of farm stands that sell fruit also have a lot of jam at their stand. And there's a reason for that. And it's because you can, take the overage of that fruit or the seconds of that fruit, create a product that is shelf stable and that you can charge a higher dollar amount for. And so the way that we plan our menus and what we plan for what's in our farm store is meant to be purely reflective of what's coming out of the field, both in, there's this really special thing that we only get a couple of quarts of, and so the kitchen gets it and we get to showcase it, or we are drowning in peppers and we need to have peppers on every single course. That's sort of how it plays out.
Never a dull moment, there's always something you have to get creative with. And it's exactly what you framed out, really hits home for me. I'm actually a retired farmer myself. I farmed for 20 years, a little small vegetable farm on a floodplain. So we had a lot of flood events, and we had to get creative with our chefs, whenever things happened and we would have to harvest everything all at once. We're like, oh my goodness, we have all of this. Can we get creative together and find a source for this? So I think communities, really, if we're having those connections that are very strong and resilient between the people, then I think that there's an avenue forward when crisis occurs. Wouldn't you agree? Yeah, definitely. There was a question in the chat that I just noticed that I want to highlight. Someone highlighting, the crisis in the war in Ukraine and how that really affected grain production, and how, how does the public how can the public best help when a crisis occurs on a farm? Do you have thoughts around that?
That's a good question. I maybe have a non-answer answer. It's a really severe problem, and it's a significant problem, and it's sometimes hard when these problems are that big, or they feel really big. With something like Ukraine, it's an entire country, it's entire people. How could we possibly help, given where we are and the resources that we have? for myself anyways, it feels most useful to kind of bring that problem as like as local as I can, almost in a way. I feel like Wendell Berry does a nice job of thinking through this philosophy that I try to adopt sometimes, which is the idea that you can't really love something until you know it. Like knowledge is what happens first. And so like personally, I don't know everything about Ukraine, but I do know something about growing wheat. So what can I use my knowledge for to help maybe that's growing a few more acres of wheat this year, because I know Ukraine may not be able to get wheat to us or other parts of the world. So maybe I could grow a little bit more wheat. Maybe I can encourage other farmers in our area to do something similar. But I think what it comes down to for me is when there are these like cracks in our food system, whether that's globally or otherwise, it's a reminder to just get to know where your food comes from. I feel like that's such a cliche now, but like that, the power in that knowledge is really significant, and it allows us to really care for the sources of our food when we know it. So, again, it feels like a non-answer and not quite like substantial enough, but these types of situations remind me of that, I think, in a powerful way.
Yeah, and I think that you're absolutely right on. And I think that part of it too is that by knowing it and by understanding that you play a role in our food system and in the grain chain, we talk about the grain chain as like the movement from the production all the way into someone's belly, that you're an active member of that. And so you need to show up. And we think about that a lot in, like look at a farmer's market, for example. Sometimes when it's rainy, I don't really want to go to the farmer's market and like get stuff, but those growers still have to go, and they've already harvested everything that they're going to bring to that market. And maybe they've looked ahead to the weather and said, it's probably going to rain and be cold, so I'm going to like harvest a little less. But, that is one of the most disheartening days, is when you've already put all that work in. And so you're locked into going to that market and then nobody shows up. Yep. And I think that consumers play such a critical role in shaping the system that they want to see, because it's the carrot, right? That we talk about this a lot with large scale grain production, that I don't believe that we grow so much corn and soy in our country because all of these farmers are like really passionate about corn and soy. It's because there's money to be made in that. And in a way that like you have to have a financially stable business to be able to keep doing it. And so if there were money to be made growing oats for like say oat milk or, some of these things, I think that people would do that. And so as a consumer, then I have to help create that market. Yeah. And I think to the global issues too, it's also looking at what the product mix is that we want to see. So, I think about this, I think there's sometimes a lot of shaming that happens around, large scale conventional production. Well, in some parts of our country, you're being a better steward of the land by farming something on a larger scale that is shelf stable. Like if you look at Idaho or Montana, there's a tremendous amount of bean production that happens in those states. And there's large parts of those states that have very rural areas. Right. And so it does not make sense to have 20 cucumber farms in rural Montana, where then that's such an energy intensive crop to then move into the market, whereas dried beans and pulses and things like that are shelf stable, and so they're less energy intensive to move around the country or the world. And so it's about like there's no one right answer, and so it's about thinking critically about what you want to see and also sort of what those folks are saying is best for their climate and then supporting them in it. And I think when it ties back to Ukraine, it's like I like to think that people knew that Ukraine is the breadbasket of Europe, but I hope that more people know that now. Mm-hmm. And I hope that it triggers this memory of the early days of the pandemic when there was no flour on the shelves. And right. Imagine what that feels like, not only because you're locked at home and you want to make sourdough, but because your buildings are exploding because someone has invaded your country, and like what that means and how like there's a reason that Russia wants to annex Ukraine, and it's because of their agricultural output. Food is power. And it's like, I feel like I'm getting like worked up about it, but it's really like, that's how real this stuff is. And it's something that's very esoteric for a lot of people.
Yeah, we we had a seed summit earlier this year, and we had Dr. Vandana Shiva did one of our keynotes, and she's often been quoted saying, "You control the food, you control the people." And I think that's exactly what's happening with our friends in Europe. I think another piece I want to mention too is you really highlight a point that's been prevalent in the slow food international circles. In the past, we've referred to consumers as co-producers because we really value the input and the choices that our co-producers make that help us make decisions as growers and as the producers of the food. We can't do it in a vacuum. We have to do it together and with input from each other. So thank you so much for highlighting that point. I think it's, and thanks for the person who dropped that question in the chat. We could talk about this forever. Maybe we should, we should have a part 2. But I want to bring the focus back to the beans and the grains and sort of key up our conversation that is about to turn into a demo with Abra and Wes in the kitchen. But I'm curious about, you had your first book, Abra, was Roughage, all about vegetables. And then you followed it with Grist about grains, beans, seeds, and legumes. And what was your inspiration to go from vegetables to grains and beans?
I mean, Wes. I'm not exaggerating. I think that Roughage is so much about my time farming vegetables and how farming produce really changed my cooking style. And most of it had been written before I started at Granor Farm. And so then I wrote it, and I had about a year in the post-production where I was just kind of thinking about food again in this way. And all of a sudden, Wes was bringing in these bags of wheat that had just been harvested, or the first edible black beans. And the same time, my cousin started growing edible black beans. And I just never really ate that many beans before that, because I always thought they're going to take forever. I always forget to soak them, blah, 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 blah. And then all of a sudden there were these things that were so different from the traditional bottom shelf beans from the grocery store. And it really was remarkable to me, because it reminded me so much of the first artisan cup of coffee that I had, where it was oh, this is a totally different thing than my cup of mud that I kind of grew up with. And, and that there's all these different flavors, and there's all of these different behaviors and things like that. And so it was really getting to explore and to know something new about an ingredient that's also an agricultural product that I just had not had. I always just thought of it as sort of a shelf stable pantry staple. And so really understanding that this is a live and varied ingredient, and that it takes, kind of working with it slightly differently. And then also in a lot of ways, it is a vegetable book part 2, but kind of seen through this other lens. And I think as it was also really shaped by, I had agreed to write the book before the start of the pandemic, but the pandemic really shaped how that book is written, because when I was writing it in March of 2020 was when we were going through the flour shortages and the bean shortages and the, grocery stores with nothing on the shelves. And it was so striking to me to come out of, a food media world where sometimes the more decadent or the more technique laden item is the most praised, to suddenly be but when everybody's nervous and scared, the thing that they're going to are these staples. And I think they deserve a level of respect that I don't know that I had ever given them before. And so those were kind of the two impetus for it.
Yeah, and you highlight several times throughout the book that both beans, which are a food, and grains, which are a food, are also just seeds. And it's a very powerful thing to realize, isn't it? Each little seed represents life, and you could truly just take these seeds and plunk them in the ground and grow plants that give you more of these seeds, which can then become food. And that's sort of why we highlighted beans with our Plant a Seed campaign this year, because they're such great teachers at teaching us about the life cycles in soil and the way that they pull nitrogen from the atmosphere and put it at the roots to share with other crops. And, I really appreciated you highlighting that notion throughout the book that they're seeds, and you can sprout them and you can do so many different things with them. And they're so versatile. I love how you organize this book, Abra, beans, rice, tiny grains, and wheat berries. It's a very human way to think about these little seeds. You got your Phaseolus vulgaris, which are your basic common bean, and then you got your rices and the itty bitty grains like amaranth, which are also a staple in some parts of the world, and then the wheat berries, which you can do so much with. I also liked this concept that you brought up, which was your desert island strategy. If you were on a desert island with beans, can you illuminate that?
Yeah, it's funny because I feel like maybe I'm like always preparing for the apocalypse, but I've always kind of thought like, I'm really bad at memorizing stuff. And so like the exact ratio of like water to rice to get the perfect pot. And so instead it's like, what can you learn about those ingredients so that if you were to like wake up in a daze on a desert island and all you had in front of you was like a pot, some water and some rice, like what would you do? And I mean, it's sort of a false premise because presumably you would also be like freaking out because you have no idea why you're on a desert island and who left the pot for you to cook this rice in. But nonetheless, after you sort of work through that shock and concern, you'd be like, oh, I'm kind of hungry. And so then it's like, how can you take this when you have no other information and make something out of it? And it started with my friend Allison, Allison Scott, who's a chef in Chicago, and we cooked together for a long time. And I was asking her specifically, like, what's the ratio for rice again? And she was like, oh, I don't bother. I just boil it like pasta. And at some point I realized that all of these ingredients could just very simply be boiled. And it's such a great introduction point because I think most people feel like they can boil pasta. And so, you can have the fanciest, most esoteric grain. And the best thing you can do is just for the first time, boil it in salted water and then taste it and see what do you want to pair with that. I think that we've ceded a lot of authority in our food system to say, you need to have the perfect flavor combination with it, or someone else is going to tell you like buckwheat and carrots go really well together. But most of the time, if I'm not sure what to pair with something, I just taste a little bit of it and then shut my eyes and just think about like what other flavors come to mind. And then usually you can build something from there. And so that's kind of the desert island strategy, is like, just cook it really simply and then taste it and see what else you want to put with it. And usually it's something that's already in my fridge, but yeah.
Exactly. And you also, I love the formula. You have a great idea for a formula for how to think about food. And, I think things like beans and grains, people maybe need them demystified a little bit in the kitchen. And, do I soak? Do I boil? Do I add salt? Do I add baking salt? Like, how do I cook these so they're perfect? And I love how not precious you make cooking these things, because it makes it very approachable. Can you tell us your flavor combination, which basically is rooted in your formula, which is this plus this plus this equals delicious, but
it equals yum.
which equals yum, exactly. But you had another one for beans.
Yeah, I mean, so there's lots of those different formulas kind of sprinkled throughout the book. And part of that is I think in my writing, I'm always trying to take the information that I sort of have built in over, the last 15 plus years of cooking, and how do you make that sort of like a theory as opposed to a recipe to memorize and follow. And so for most of the time, these ingredients are kind of the like structure of the dish. They're either the like carbohydrate that's anchoring the dish, or they're the rich stewy bean kind of thing. And so what are the components that are needed to make that really sing? And oftentimes, because those flavors are so rich and so like kind of bass note to it, like if you think about it in terms of music, what you're looking to add in is something like an acidity to give it some brightness, or something that's going to kind of make it pop a little bit, and then also something that's adding a little bit of texture to it. And so because if anyone has made a giant pot of beans or lentils, by day 4, you recognize it's kind of one texture. And so you want to add a little something to make it exciting. And so oftentimes, especially for the beans, it's like add in, you know, something that's a little bit starchy because, you know, beans and carbohydrates, that's a perfect food. You can live off that. And then something really acidic and bright, like a dressing or a relish, or my friend Erin, who cooks here with us, always refers to that as a rig, which is some sort of like unspecified, chunky, acidic, delicious relish. And so you spoon that over the top, and then something kind of crunchy, like garlic breadcrumbs or chopped nuts or something like that, just to give it a little bit of texture.
Awesome. These are really great basic thoughts to as we approach cooking beans or grains. And you know, you really, I want to get you in the kitchen to start the demo, but I just want to highlight you throughout the book. You highlight so many different cooking techniques that can be used with all of these the legumes and the grains. You can blanch them, you can boil them, you can fry them, you can marinate them, you risotto them, you make risotto of herb, you can sprout them, you can stew them, and the last one is you can grind them into flour. Both beans, all legumes you can make into flour, and obviously the grains we can make into flour, and that's what we're going to highlight in the kitchen today. Is that right?
Yeah, so we're gonna make socca, which is I think this is actually one of my like desert island dinners, is that or it's more accurately, it's like, you know, when you go on a trip and then you've been flying and your flight got delayed and you finally get home and it's like too late to get takeout from somewhere, but you're also like so hungry and you feel like garbage and you don't have anything in your fridge because you've been gone for a week. Well, this is the dinner that I always make in that situation because it always makes us feel really good. We always have chickpea flour on hand. So today we're going to be using Bob's Red Mill chickpea flour. And, you know, real shout out to Bob's Red Mill. They're an amazing company. It's employee owned. And I think that they are almost single-handedly responsible for making a lot of these sorts of grains that are available in even like rural grocery stores, you know, and so they're often like so available that my grocery store that is, you know, about 20 minutes away and doesn't have a huge population attending it is able to get teff, flaxseed, you know, camu, all of these different grains. And it's really because of Bob's Red Mill. And so the fact that chickpea flour has been so available is really a blessing. So, and it's really fast. It's like, well, why don't I'll just show you.
Do it. Let's take us into the kitchen.
We're going to spin our camera. So anyone who gets motion sick, just shut your eyes for a second.
Appreciate the warning. Thank you. Have you ever made chickpea flour yourself from the chickpeas?
You know, I tried to one time, and I think the mill really protested. I just had a little like tabletop stove mill, and I tried to run some chickpeas through it, and it was very grouchy because of it. And for Wes is going to pull double duty as operations manager and farmer, and also second camera assistant. So he's going to try to get in some of the other visuals. But my setup for right now is we've got just a regular old frying pan. I like to use a cast iron, but you can really use anything that you've got. You don't need to use nonstick for it because we're going to add a fair amount of oil to it. So I like to turn it on, and I just have it on like high heat right now because you want the cast iron to really permeate that heat so that you get an even cook. And then what we're going to do is take my bowl here and put in our chickpea flour, and I don't even measure it anymore, but you can, it's just equal parts. So we'll add some chickpea flour. This is probably about a cup's worth. And then we're gonna add in about a cup's worth of soda water. And you can use regular water. I've made this with beer before, all sorts of things, and just a pinch of salt. I like adding something with the bubbles to it because then it makes it so it gets a little bit of extra lift. So it's a little bit fluffier than if you didn't have the lift to it. But it's still very tasty with just water or, you know, any of that sort of stuff with it. I would say if you're going to use a seltzer water, just avoid the pamplemousse flavor, the like flavored LaCroix. It gets real weird real fast. And then you just whisk it together to make a batter. And I think that like the thicker and thinner of the batter, I use about 2-to-1 flour to soda water for something to make like a batter for like chicken tenders, or if you're dredging any sort of like a pakora, like dredging vegetables in it and frying it. And then if you go thicker, it'll hold its shape a little bit more like an actual, like a almost like an arepa or something like that, where you're holding that texture. And I've got something that's a little smoky in our pan, so I'm just gonna wipe that out real quick. And then, so you can see the like smoke coming off of the pan right now. What we're gonna do is turn that heat down a little bit now that we know that the pan is nice and hot. And the other secret to socca is that you use more oil than you think you're gonna need. So that's probably about 1/4 cup of olive oil. And then that's gonna both make it so that it doesn't stick, but you're also getting that nice flavor of the olive oil in your pancake. And you can do this, the more flour that you put in, the more flour and water, the more that you're gonna get a bigger or a wider pancake or something like that, or you can get it to be thicker. I like it about like this, where you're gonna see the bubbles coming through. It's basically like a pancake batter. And then it's gonna cook through. So once it's in there, I turn the heat down a little bit so that it has time to brown on the bottom, and then it'll continue kind of soaking up that oil, which is gonna give you a nice crispness as well. And while that's cooking, I literally just go through my kitchen and think through like, what do we have in the kitchen in any way? So I grabbed 3 cabbage leaves. So these are a really pretty Savoy cabbage that we're just gonna do a quick little cut on to make little ribbons, and a nice cabbage salad. And a rough little cut like that. That's gonna go into our bowl here. And then a little pinch of of salt. I forgot my spoon, and so I'm just gonna grab a spoon. And this is one of those kind of acidic rigs. This is, chopped up olives, a little bit of bell pepper, and some capers and things like that. So it's just like a weird random dressing that I found in the fridge. But this could be anything from just olive oil, a little bit of goat cheese, things like that, to get in there. And I can see that we're getting some browning around the pancake. So I'm just gonna go underneath it with my spatula. And then a quick little flip. And at this point, I usually just turn the heat off my burner because it's gonna have enough heat on the underside to finish it. And so you've got those nice crispy, crunchy edges. This is maybe a touch darker than I would normally go. I got nervous being on camera, so I let the pan get really hot. But you can get that little bit of browning is fine. It'll have kind of a nice caramelization. And then we've got our cabbage salad. And we're just gonna toss that up and together. And like everything, give it a little bit of a taste. But I've done this with, in the springtime, I love it with, fresh spinach or shaved raw asparagus or things like that. And then you can just take it straight out of the pan and onto either your cutting board or a plate or something like that. Take your knife and you can cut it. This is really great for appetizers too. So you can make little wedges to go into dips or into things. You can use them, make little tiny pancakes and do like for canapes and just top it with a little salad. I like to go just straight into wedges, and then you can kind of stack it up on your plate for your guests. And you can see just how like fluffy the inside of that is. And it's also because it's all chickpea flour, it's totally gluten-free. So this is also something that we keep on hand in the kitchen at Granor, because if someone arrives and they're gluten-free, we have a really quick substitution. It's also vegan. And so it's a really nice option for like a vegan customer who, you know, might be afraid that they're not going to get something interesting and they're just going to get like a plain old pasta or something like that. And then I always just top it with the fresh veg. So you're getting your like fresh crunchiness from the cabbage, a little bit of salad like that. And then you can do a little more dressing over the top. And if I had some fresh goat cheese, I might like dot that over the top, or a little bit of ricotta would be really nice with it. In the summertime, we'll do chickpea pancakes and then some ricotta and sliced tomato and a little bit of basil on top. You could do it with stewed peppers. You could do it with shaved raw radishes. You know, it's really, the sky is the limit. And so anything that you want to put on top just has to be like tasty and delicious. So that's our little cooking demo. It's a, you know, the fastest dinner you could ever need to make, 3 ingredients and a cast iron pan.
That's so wonderful. Oh my gosh. Thank you so much for putting that together. And I feel like I'm just gonna put that straight on my rotation for dinners when it when
Yeah.
you know, when
Great,
time
I'll mix
is
it up.
tight. Yeah, exactly. There, someone is asking if we can get a super close up of a
Sure.
the socca and the, get Wesley right in there. Oh, nice. Very good. Thank you so much. Lots of love for the GF things. We were curious if you grow buckwheat at Granor Farm, and
Yeah,
most-
we do. Buckwheat is a crop we added a couple years ago. For actually some very pragmatic reasons. We needed a crop that was not a grass. We grow a lot of grasses or things in the grass family. We grow corn, wheat, rye, barley, oats. They're all grasses. And so part of our crop rotation is to try to break that up by plant family. So having a legume or multiple legumes in that is really nice. So with a edible bean or a soybean or any type of bean we can grow. And buckwheat is another great one because it's a pseudo cereal. It's not actually a grass. It's in a whole different plant family. So it gives us a nice opportunity to grow something that is, isn't susceptible to the same diseases that a grass might be. The other nice thing about buckwheat is it's a much shorter season crop. So if you think about like corn, for instance, we plant that at the end of May and it's harvested in October and November. So it takes the whole year to grow. Buckwheat, we can plant in the middle of June and we'll harvest it around Labor Day. So it's much more condensed, and that gives us more time in the fall to plant a fall planted crop, probably winter rye or wheat or barley. So it really fits nicely into what we're trying to do agronomically in a crop rotation. And it's also fun to grow. A lot of farmers ask us, you know, we're kind of the crazy farmers on the block. They're like kind of scratching their head when they're driving past our fields, like, what is Wes doing? Like, what is he growing? That looks like a wheat. And then I get to tell them, no, this is actually buckwheat. Buckwheat also competes really well with weeds. So it's nice in an organic system in that way. And we've actually sold a lot of it for cover crop seed to other farmers who want to plant it as a cover crop, which is great. So we feel like we can obviously use it as food grade, a food grade product here on the farm and do cool things with it. But we can also help other farmers kind of get some experience with it by selling it as seed. So buckwheat fits in really nicely to what we're trying to do here.
Yeah, and I think was declining in popularity there for a while, but now with the resurgence of GF concerns, I think it's coming back into popularity. Wouldn't you agree?
Yeah, definitely. And one of the things that we talk about a lot when we're thinking about a crop like buckwheat is, you know, folks might ask, like, well, why don't more farmers grow buckwheat? Like, if it's such a good crop on all these different levels, like I just talked about, like it's agronomically, it makes sense. It's a relatively low cost crop to grow and you get a pretty good price for it. If all these things are true, then why don't more farmers grow buckwheat? There's there's a lot of different answers to that question, but a big part of that is going back to, I think, Abra's earlier point about the grain chain, like what gets grain from the field to our table.
Right.
And buckwheat in particular is for any of you that have seen buckwheat, you know, it's got a really kind of interesting and tough hull on the outside of the grain. And for a lot of applications, you've got to take that hull away. It has to be dehulled. And we don't have a lot of that infrastructure here in the country anymore, in basically North America, to handle buckwheat, just because we don't grow that much, or that infrastructure is relatively consolidated now. So it's really tough for farmers to grow buckwheat and then actually get it to the high value end use. So there's a lot of different steps in that work of getting your crop like out of the field into the bin, processed, dehulled, cleaned, and then finally milled into flour that you might use for something, so there's and right now, frankly, there's not a lot of folks that help farmers along that path. So we're kind of figuring it out for ourselves. But all that to say, there's a lot of groups that are doing really good work in trying to make those connections happen. Artisan Grain Collaborative, I'll highlight as one that's doing a lot of work with farmers in the upper Midwest to kind of make those connections happen. So farmers have a place to take that crop. Because we can grow a really valuable crop like buckwheat and have a whole bin full of it. But if we don't have a way to clean it, or if we don't have a buyer, it's worth nothing. And so there's a lot of different components to, some of these crops that not a lot of people are growing yet.
Yeah, remembering how to grow these ancient grains and, and bringing some of those tools back as part of this process of increasing the biodiversity in our fields. Someone else, I guess we can stay on the pancake theme a little bit. We had the chickpea flour for a pancake. We have buckwheat, you can use it for pancakes. Someone said they were using oat flour for pancakes as well, which is a really nice touch. Also GF. So there's lots of opportunities to use grains and legumes in our pancake repertoire. There's a question here about kernza, the grain. What are your thoughts about that? It's all over the sustainability conversation.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. So we've been growing kernza. I think we planted our first field of kernza back in 2017 or 2018. We were lucky enough fortunate enough to get some seed from the Land Institute that's been helping develop this crop over many, many years. It's really an interesting crop. It looks nothing like the other things that we grow. I think a lot of literature that I've read on it kind of compares it to wheat or another cereal grain. It really appears something like fundamentally different when you see it in the field. The shape of the plant is a little bit different. It's very much like a miniaturized version of wheat. The kernels are much smaller just because of the nature of the plant. Like it's a perennial, it's not an annual. So the physiological nature of what that plant is trying to do every year is much different than an annual crop. I think there's been a lot of, like Patagonia and others have really done a nice job, I think, researching how do we use something. We've come up with this grain. Okay, now what do we do with it? Well, we can make beer with it. We can make flour with it. What are the end uses for it? And I think kernza makes a lot of sense from an environmental standpoint, an ecological standpoint, right? Having perennial agriculture in place is really powerful. It's one of the quickest ways to build soil health is to have something there, have the living roots there all the time. So the question becomes like, how do we get more farmers on board, right? How do we get more folks ready to grow something like kernza? And these questions kind of go back to what we were just talking about with buckwheat. And it's almost like a chicken and the egg situation, right? Do we need more processors of kernza first, or do we need more farmers growing kernza first? Like what has to happen first to allow more kernza to get into the market, to get into consumers' hands? I don't know if I have a perfect answer for that, but I think we feel really grateful to see this work happening with companies like Patagonia and others that are saying, all right, we'll take the initiative, we'll come up with a product that uses this kernza, and that will quickly encourage farmers to grow more of it, because farmers, like Abra was saying earlier, are incredibly, despite the stereotype that, there's like a little bit of ignorance and farmers maybe aren't the brightest bulb in the box, like all the farmers I know are incredibly smart, incredibly intelligent, and they pay attention to what people want. Like they're going to grow what the market, what people are calling for. So I think the same is going to be true with kernza, is as we develop a market share for what this grain can do, like the farmers will grow it. If it's worth growing, the farmers will grow it. Like we're a really ingenious bunch and creative, and there will be a way to make that happen. I'm confident in that.
Thank you so much for that. We're at the end of our time here, but I did want to get a quick answer to a question that was asked a couple of times. If you have experimented with hemp at all as a cover crop at the farm.
That's a good question. We have not. We see hemp, I've seen it around more and more, and have talked to other organic growers at conferences and things about their experiences with it. As a cover crop, especially, we have not tried it. The seed to hemp is still relatively expensive. So when I'm looking at what to plant as a cover crop, it's not a crop that I'm going to be harvesting. So there's a part of like the financial equation that comes into that. Obviously, I want a crop that's going to do what I need it to in terms of nutrients and ground cover and, what it's doing for soil health. And right now, there's maybe a couple of options that are a little more affordable than hemp that would do a similar thing. That being said, I think growing hemp for the variety of uses now in terms of, industrial, whether it's clothing or otherwise, I think those are really cool initiatives. Not something that I personally have a ton of experience with, but I'm excited to see that happening in the Midwest.
Wow. Well, Wes and Abra, you both have been just so delightful to spend the afternoon with, and just full of so much information and details and facts and ideas. And I just think I want to thank you both so much for the knowledge and experience you've brought to our Slow Food Live today. People have been chatting it up in the chat room here, and I want to thank the audience for spending this afternoon with us as well, and all of your enthusiasm. Thank you so much for joining us, and everybody remember to head over to our bookshop and check out Abra's books. They're beautiful, they're fun to read, and they're just full of so much information. I'm sure that we're going to all put some of these ideas into rotation in our kitchens at home. Thank you both so much. And I want to remind folks that these Slow Food Lives are constant and ongoing, and that we have that archive, and my colleague Brian can pop that link into the chat for you all to access later. And as far in the slow food realm, we have an event coming up on December 10th. It's the Snail Blazer Awards. This is where we honor individuals and communities that are furthering the mission of slow food all throughout the country. And so we have a really fun awards ceremony happening on December 10th. Grab your popcorn, do a live viewing with some friends. There's an auction associated with the Snail Blazer Awards. There's a link that's, I think, popping into our chat just now, where you can just go learn more about that. But we'd love to see you there to have an evening of celebrating good, clean, and fair food with our slow food community. So thank you all so much. The recording will be available on our website. Abra and Wes, I am so hungry for socca, and I am so excited to go look for some new seeds to put in my garden next year. Thank you so much for being with us today.
Thank you so
Thanks,
much,
Mara.
Mara. Yeah, I appreciate it.
Yeah. And thank you to Topacio for doing all the interpretation.